Hello and welcome to a OpenSim Creator video tutorial. I'm Adam, a software developer on the project. In this video tutorial, we're going to be creating a double pendulum using the mesh importer. If you'd like to follow along with the tutorial, you'll need to have OpenSim Creator installed, and I'll put the details of how to do that up in the video description. If you find that I'm going too fast or too slow in this video, you might prefer to follow the written version of it. From OpenSim Creator, you can click Open Documentation here, which will open the documentation in the browser. And the tutorial we're going through is number 3, use the mesh importer. And this is what we're going to be creating, and the content of this video is going to try and closely follow the content of this tutorial. Give or take 1 for 1, it's just that I'm going to be going through it. So let me just get back to OpenSim Creator. Okay, so yes, what we're going to be doing first is opening the mesh importer. To do that, you can either click here on Import Meshes, or you can click up here in Import Meshes. Both do the same thing. And once you've opened that, you'll be in a mesh importer, which looks like this. Now, just as a brief overview, what the mesh importer is a 3D scene that lets you freely move things around in preparation for that scene to be converted into an OpenSim model. So, for example, what I can do is I can right-click here, and this isn't part of the tutorial, I'm just kind of showing what you can do. You can right-click here, you can add a body, right? You can right-click here again, add another body, and you can freely move these things without having to worry too much about joint topology, which you would have to be concerned about if you're working with an OpenSim model. And then I can add joints, I can change joint types, I can go up here, perform basic rotations. I can then figure out, okay, maybe I'd like to attach meshes to these objects. So here I have some mesh files. I'm going to go through a basic cube here. And then once I'm happy with what I've done in the mesh importer, I can click Convert to OpenSim Model. And I end up with an OpenSim model that I can simulate. And crucially, it's a model that I can save and work on. So I could, for example, go to save dialog, and I could save it as some model, right? I end up with an OSIM file, an OpenSim file. Now if I go into OpenSim GUI, I can then use this file just with standard OpenSim tooling. So now I have a model, I can simulate it using the OpenSim GUI, and it works fine. So the advantage of the mesh importer is that it lets you quickly throw together a scene in a kind of free-form fashion, get it into OpenSim, and then you have a model that you can then start adding muscles to and start working with. Okay, so I'm going to go and click New up here, and what we're going to try and do now is create this double pendulum. So to start off with, let's have a look. I have a copy of a tutorial here, so this is a little bit ramshackles, but what we're going to do is create a body for the top pendulum. So the way I would do this is to add a body to the scene by right-clicking and clicking body, or by clicking up here and clicking add body. Right, and this is going to be our pendulum body. And I'm going to name it pendulum head by right-clicking and calling it pendulum head. Right. And I can also right-click here to do the same thing, by the way. So anything you can right-click on in the 3D scene, you can also right-click on it in the hierarchy, and you get the same menu, in case you can't click something in the scene. Once I've renamed it, I'm also going to move it up to, let's look at the note here, at 0.5, right? So this is our pendulum head at 0.5 up in Y. And the coordinates you see here and the rotations you see here are in the ground plane and world space, if you'd like to call it that. Okay, so the next step is to create a second body. And to do that, I'm going to use a right-click menu, and it's called Pendulum Head 2. So we just type there, Pendulum Head 2. And this is going to be located at 0.25 in Y. Okay, so now we have two bodies. We need to have them joined to each other with a joint to create our pendulum. So the next thing we want to do is right-click the bottom body for pendulum head 2 and go all the way down here to join 2. This is going to create a joint from the thing we've right clicked to the thing we're about to click. So if I click here and I then click this top body for pendulum head, I'll then be presented with this, which is the kind of joint center, and this is a joint that connects this body to this body, right? And then what we want to do is change this joint to be called, let's have a look at the tutorial notes over here, pendulum head to pendulum head. And I apologize for the long names, it's just because it makes it easier for me to read. And then we're going to translate it to the parent's location. So this is effectively the same as just typing 0.5 in this box here, but it's a little shortcut you can use. And now we've got a joint center in the same location as this pendulum head. And the last step here is to change it into a pin joint, because at the moment it's a weld joint, which wouldn't move by itself. We're going to change it to a pin joint, which has 1 degree of freedom along Z. The next step is to join the body to ground, right? So what we have now is we have this body is joined to that body, and it can this body can rotate along this joint axis. This body here doesn't have any joint right now, so the mesh importer is going to automatically add a weld joint, which isn't necessarily what you want. So what is better to do is to explicitly create your own joint and say where it's going to be. So if I right click this body, I go join to, I'm going to create a joint from this top body to ground, right, which is put a joint in the midpoint, which just so happens to be where the bottom body is, right? And let me just undo this step here. Undo. So what we want to do is we want to move this up above both of the pendulums. Now in the tutorial notes, I think I've said it's like 0.75, right? And now we've got a joint that's above this body. And if I change that to a pin joint, and I give it a name, pendulum head to ground, we now have 2 bodies where this body is attached to that body on a joint here, and this body is attached to ground but with this joint here. And what that means is that this body can only swing along this joint center, right? So we effectively have a whole pendulum here. We've got 2 bodies, we've got 2 joints, it's a double pendulum. And the next step now is to just quickly test it. So you can take a scene and you can click convert to OpenSim model down here. There's this huge block of text, but effectively what it's saying is it's going to take this 3D scene, convert it into an OpenSim model, and then present that to you in the OpenSim editor. But a thing to note is that if you click this button, you can always go back to the screen. So if you screwed something up or you forgot to do something, you don't lose your progress here. You can click here and you get your OpenSim scene. But if at any point you want to go back, you can click in the top left here and click import meshes, and it just sends you back to the mesh importer as it was. So just a good thing to know. But anyway, we've just imported our scene, and now we have the renderer showing like the frames we've added into our OpenSim model. So these are the frame geometries for, if I go and get the property editor panel here, which may be stacked somewhere else on your screen. I'm just going to go ahead and snap it down here. So we got a frame geometry here, which is part of the pin joint, right? And we've got another frame geometry here, which is the frame geometry for pendulum head 2. So that's your bottom pendulum. And what this is all saying is like, yes, this is an OpenSim model. It has some bodies, it has some pin joints, and they're all attached to each other. Now, if we were to simulate this model now by clicking Control R or hitting this green button up here, you can see that not much happens, and the reason why is because the bodies are all vertically aligned, right? The gravity is going down, there's no reason for this to swing. So if we go back to the editor, we can then play around with these coordinates. Now these are joint coordinates, and what this is doing is it's saying, well, this is the coordinate of this pin joint down here, right? And this one is the coordinate of this joint up here. And what I'm doing is I'm pre-swinging the pendulum a little bit, and if you simulate that, you can see like, okay, I've got a pendulum. Great. So that's the advantage of being able to move between the mesh importer and the OpenSim editor. Once it's in OpenSim, you can then change coordinates, edit the model, and simulate it to make sure that you're on the right track as you work through your meshes. The other virtue of it being an OSIM is that you can now save it, right? So I can save it here as some model. I'll just overwrite my last attempt here. And once it's saved, you can then open the official OpenSim GUI. And you should be able to just open this model file. And as you can see, yep, it's a pendulum. Oh, this isn't the right pendulum, sorry. This is a different pendulum. Sorry. You can see that it's a model we just created. It has these two bodies, it has these two joints, but the scene is empty because OpenSim GUI by default doesn't show frames, whereas OpenSim Creator does. So the next thing is, I guess, to start adding some meshes to this model, just so we can visualize it more easily and so it's easier to actually watch. So if I go back to OpenSim Creator here, the next thing we're going to do is step 3.4 in the tutorial, which is to add some decorative geometry. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the mesh importer by clicking on the top left, import meshes, and go back to the scene. Now what I want to do is to attach some meshes to various parts of the scene. The first one I'm going to do is I'm going to add a ceiling, right? And the ceiling isn't really going to swing or anything. It's just like a static ceiling that isn't really attached to any body or anything. So what I can do is just right click in the middle of nowhere and go to meshes here and pick a block mesh. Now you're going to need some mesh files. But OpenSim Creator does come with some mesh files included. You just have to figure out where it's installed. And then, so here on Windows, it's C drive program files, OpenSim Creator, resources, geometry. Right, and I personally keep this as a shortcut on my desktop so that I can keep track of it. And then if I click that, I can add, what we're going to do is add block.vtp. Which is this block file down here. And then in order to make this a ceiling, we need to move it up vertically, right? And then rescale it. So what I would do is I want this to be at the same location as where the top pivot is, because the top pivot of the pendulum, I guess, is kind of swinging off the ceiling. So I'm going to do translate to this pendulum location. Now the next problem we have is that this doesn't really look like a ceiling, it looks like a cube, right? So what we can do here is we can click it, and we could just edit these scale factors to match what it's saying in the tutorial. So we could write like 5 here, what is it in the tutorial, 0.1 here, and then 5 to give you like a nice ceiling panel. Or if you didn't like doing it that way and you wanted to eyeball it a bit more, you can click on here where it says translate and change it to scale. And then when you select anything, it's going to give you some scale handles that you can drag around. So you could, for example, scale it this way. Right, I'm going to undo that. That's one way you could do it. But what I'm going to do is just stick with typing in what's in the tutorial. So now we have a ceiling. Next thing to do is to add some cubes to these bodies. So this ceiling here is highlighted red a little bit because to indicate that it's not attached to anything, or rather that it's attached to ground. That's fine for the ceiling. But obviously if you want it to swing along with a pendulum, you probably want to attach it to a pendulum. So in order to attach meshes to things, what you do is you can either right click on an existing mesh that isn't attached to anything, and you can go to reassign connection, and I could, for example, now assign a ceiling to this body, which isn't what I want, because what will happen if I do that, if I swing this now, you'll see the problem, is that the whole pendulum is the ceiling is going to swing along with a whole pendulum, which isn't what you want. So what you want to do is you want to right click this body, right? And you go to add meshes, and then you can add a mesh to this body. So you can add this cube to this body, and this will automatically attach the body to the mesh as well. So now you have a block attached to ground, a block attached to a cube mesh attached to this body, and a cube mesh we're going to attach one to this one also. So if I go to block, here we go. So now we have a ceiling and 2 cube meshes all attached up. Again, you can always experiment here. I'm just going to do a little bit of conversion to make sure, like, okay, does everything swing as it should before I move forward? Like, yep, that seems okay. And now what I'm going to do, next thing we want to do is have kind of a strut between the blocks and the ceiling, right? So the way that I do this is that whenever this swings, the strut's going to swing with it. So I guess the strut is attached to the body, and it just needs to be moved between the body and the ceiling. And one problem we've actually got here is that, and this is common when working with more complicated scenes, is that now I want to click the body to attach meshes to it, but I can't because now there's a block covering it. There's a few tricks to get around this. One is that you can turn down the color of a mesh, the alpha channel, which is this A here. You can make the meshes kind of semi-transparent, like this. And then you can go to interactivity up here, which determines what you can and can't click in a 3D scene. And you can just make it so you can't click on meshes. So now if I scroll over, you can see it's hitting the body or it's hitting the joint. It's just a little weird side effect is that if a body is attached to a mesh, it will also select the mesh for kind of grouped together once they're attached. So you have to be quite careful about what you're clicking on, but there's one way to do it. If you hold down Alt, though, so if I click this, it's going to click both the body and the mesh because of the grouping effect. But if you hold down Alt when you're clicking, it will only click the thing you actually moused over, which is this body. So yeah, that's one handy thing to know. And if I right-click it, it will show me the context menu for the body that I've right-clicked, not the mesh, because I've disabled it in interactivity. So these are just like little tricks that are handy to know. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach another block to this body. Right, and I'm going to attach this block. Now, this block is overlapping with the previous block, so I guess what I should do here is move it up a little bit, just so I can actually see it. And I'm going to move it up to here for a second. So this is the block we just added. Let me just change the translator for those handles. And what we're trying to do here is we want to move this block between the top pendulum and the bottom, and between this kind of top body and the ceiling. And we could do that by like figuring out what the midway point is between 0.75 and 0.5 and typing that in. But another trick is that, let me just make it so I can select meshes again. Another trick is that you can right click the mesh, you can click translate here between two things. So I could say translate it between here and here. And now this block's between. And now we have a block that's going to act as our strut, but it doesn't really look like a strut. It looks like a block. So the next thing we need to do is rescale it. So if I alt-click it, just to select this, and I go to scale, again, I could eyeball this and figure out, like, okay, what type of scale do I want? It was being a bit glitchy there. Sorry. Interesting. What the hell? Apparently I can't scale it along that axis. It's getting quite screwy about it. I apologize, this is alpha software. Let me just undo this. So normally you can manually scale, but I'm going to say you can't for this case. So if I alt-click it, I'm going to change the scale of the strut to whatever it says in the documentation. And yeah, it went for 0.2, 2.5, 0.2. So like 0.2, 2.5 to make it long, 0.2 to make it thin. Right, now we have a cube that's kind of between our two bodies. And again, we can convert it and we can do something like this. And we can swing it and okay, great. Like it's looking a bit closer to a pendulum. So back to the importer. And we're going to do the same for this block here. So again, I'm going to, I'm going to have to attach it to this body. So I could do this whole interactivity thing again, or I could just go over to here to the right click menu and right click on the body I want to attach to. And then I'm going to attach that block. Again, the block is overlapping. So I want to translate that block between here and here. And again, the scale factors need to be fixed up. So 0.2, 2.5, 0.2. Okay. And now we've got our two bodies, our two joints, and our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meshes, right? And that should hopefully be that. So now we've got our model all kind of skinned up. We can give it a little test swing to make sure that, okay, yeah, it's a pendulum. Right, and there you go. You've made a pendulum using the mesh importer. So hopefully that's a good introduction to kind of a few tricks you can use in the mesh importer to get bodies in the right place and joints in the right place. And some extra tips for this particular tutorial. So let me just scroll through. Yeah, one thing we can do is that we can, now that it's in kind of import into OpenSim, we can now save this as a model, right? So if I click kind of save and I save it somewhere, right? And I then open that in OpenSim. Now that it's all skinned up, we close the previous model. And now you can see that, oh, okay, like it's an OpenSim model. Like I can open it in OpenSim and I can do whatever I want to do in OpenSim, where there's a lot more tooling available for taking kind of simulation measurements, right? So yeah, so now I have my model and it's in OpenSim. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing that's quite handy to know is that, let me just close that. Another thing that's handy to know is that you can also do like basic measurements now that it's in an OpenSim. So for example, you can right click on something and you can request outputs, and you could, for example, plot the linear velocity magnitude of the pendulum head body, right? So if I go here, I go magnitude, I run a simulation. You can see that now it's plotting the linear linear velocity rather, right? So, and this can be retrospectively applied if you have simulation results already. So I can, for example, go and ask for something else. I don't know, like the Y position, something like this, let's say, of the body. And then I can go back to the simulator and I can see that like, oh, it's like, retrospectively pulled that out of an existing simulation. So you don't need to resimulate, but you kind of need to go back to that screen to plot stuff. So yeah, anyway, hopefully this is a useful enough tutorial. And the kind of objective of this tutorial was to just introduce the mesh importer of OpenSim Creator and to show you what's possible. In the next tutorial, I'm going to be working on, we're going to be working on a much more complicated model. We're going to be working on arm, more specifically a kind of finger of an arm, because the process is kind of a repeat once you do the first finger. And that tutorial will be using a lot of the skills that are covered here. So try to make sure that you feel comfortable with the idea of putting bodies and models and converting into OpenSim models and running basic simulations and so on. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. Thank you.